By the summer of 1776, David Hume knew that he was dying. He had been for some time suffering from the same disease which had killed his mother. Yet he appeared calm and serene, still the witty and urbane conversationalist to all visitors who came to the handsome house which in 1770, at the peak of his fame, he had built in a new section of Edinburgh, on a street which was soon to be called, in his honor, St. David's Street. Among the visitors he received was James Boswell, who later became famous as a diarist and as the biographer of Samuel Johnson, the most distinguished literary figure of his time. Boswell, with a weakness for alcohol and women, was a timid man, fearful of damnation and hell, subject to periodic attacks of deep depression, and inclined toward religious piety. Boswell had for a long time been repelled and fascinated by Hume's bold and jaunty attacks upon religious belief in churchgoers. It appears that Boswell, like Samuel Johnson, was morbidly afraid of death. Boswell could not resist the temptation to go to see Hume, the God-denier, on his deathbed, to ask him if he had repented of his blasphemy, if he had changed his mind, perhaps, about denying the immortality of the soul. "Don't you believe," the nervous Boswell asked Hume, "that there is life after death, that your soul will live on after you are dead?" In complete ease, with the good humor and irony that had made Hume a celebrity, he replied, "Yes, it is possible that the soul is immortal. It's also possible that if I toss this piece of coal into the flames of that fire, it will not burn. Possible, but there is no basis for believing it, not by reason and not by sense perception, not by our experience." You can imagine Hume chuckling as Boswell backed out of the room, startled, ashamed, his neurotic fear of death stimulated by seeing Hume inexorably wasted by disease. Hume threw out a few more remarks which Boswell, with his genius for total recall, wrote down when he returned home. Hume said, quote, "That the soul is immortal and that people should exist forever is a most unreasonable fancy. The trash of every age must then be preserved, and new universes must be created to contain such infinite numbers." End quote. But how could Boswell think that Hume would abandon his own completed philosophy, which had finally brought him the fame and wealth that he'd always craved? How could Hume be expected to believe that the soul was immortal when he had triumphantly demolished the idea of any substance whatsoever, mental or physical? Since the soul is held to be a mental substance, the Humean question mounts to an immediate attack. From what impression is the idea of the soul derived? But since we have no sensory impression of the soul, the idea of the soul is worthless, incapable of passing the empiricist test of being an image of a prior sense impression. Therefore, it makes no sense whatever to inquire whether the soul is immortal. The soul is a meaningless idea. But suppose you are willing to forego the question of the immortality of the soul. What about your existence as a self, as permanent, identical, continuously the same throughout your life? Did not Descartes establish the cogito, I think, therefore I am a thinking thing, as the rock upon which he built his entire philosophy? Hume answers this challenge by swiftly demolishing Descartes' cogito proof and its idea of the self. Not only did Descartes fail to base his idea of the self as a thinking thing upon a sensory impression, he could not have done so, for as Hume points out, the idea of a self which is permanent, identical, continuously the same, must be derived from an impression that is permanent, identical, continuously the same. But, Hume adds, there is no impression constant and invariable. Hume appeals again to his theory of impressions. All impressions are separate, distinct, and transient. Quote, "Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations, succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions, or from any other, that the idea of self is derived, and consequently, there is no such idea." End quote. What, then, is Hume's own theory of the self? Doggedly applying his empiricist principle, he says, quote, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself." End quote. But there are some philosophers who claim they do, says Hume sarcastically, quote, "and who imagine that we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself." End quote. But setting them aside, Hume says, quote, "The rest of mankind are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement." End quote. This is Hume's famous bundle of perceptions theory of the self. On empiricist principles, we cannot claim to have any knowledge of the self as a unity, as permanent and continuous, but only as a series of perceptions. Strictly speaking, Hume cannot even claim that the flux of our perceptions even have the unity of a bundle. Hume is here getting close to the view of self as a stream of consciousness, which appears in writers like James Joyce in his novel Ulysses, or Marcel Proust in Remembrance of Things Past, in which the stream and flow of fragmentary perceptions make up the self. Hume himself says, quote, "The mind is a kind of theater, where perceptions successively make their appearance, pass and repass, glide away and mingle, in an infinite variety of postures and situations." End quote. There is no continuity, no permanence, no identity in these appearances in the theater of the mind. But suddenly Hume catches himself and says that strictly speaking, there's not even a theater that we can know anything about through a sense perception. Why then do you have the meaningless and unintelligible idea that you are a single self with the same personal identity throughout your lifetime? You are misled, says Hume, into belief in the self by memory, which, by the association of your past separate ideas, connects one idea with the others, and leads you to form the fictional idea that these impressions that you recall are united in some sense in a permanent self. But this fiction must be demolished by the clarity of philosophy, which shows that there is no impression from which this fictional idea could possibly be derived. How can Hume's wrecking ball demolish your idea of yourself as continuously the same? How can he deny that you have been a single self throughout your life, that you have personal identity? Do you not, after all, have memories of a very early childhood? Can you not recall events from kindergarten, early playmates, the family, the neighborhood, growing up, relatives, school, crucial events like the birth of a brother, Christmases and vacations, your first date, your first job? Could you not write your own autobiography in which all these events were gathered together and put in chronological order, so that you can say to Hume, quote, "This is my life, David Hume. I am a continuous identical person. I am a single self." End quote. But Hume has an answer for you. An idea of the self, if it is to be intelligible and meaningful, must be derived from an impression. But yourself, the subject of your autobiography, and which you claim is a single continuous self, is not derived from any one impression. Rather, Hume replies, you are referring all those impressions to a self which is imagined to exist, and to underlie them or contain them. But where is the impression of such an underlying self? Where is the impression of the single, self-same, continuous self to which all these impressions occurred, or in which they took place? Hume knows that you will have to admit that you have no such impression. There remains for us to consider Hume's views on religion and on ethics. First, as for Hume's writings on religion, they have three principal targets. 1. The rationalistic proofs of the existence of God which the medieval theologians had developed, and which we found Descartes using after he had established the cogito. 2. Deism, the rational theology which was currently attracting most of the philosophers and theologians in Hume's day, in London, Edinburgh, Paris, and in the new colonies which were to become the United States of America. And 3. The traditional religious beliefs in miracles. As for the classical proofs of God's existence by reason, Hume rejected them all. Reason, as we have seen, cannot prove anything about existence, about matters of fact. It can offer only logical and mathematical proofs. It can tell us only about relations of ideas. This existence of God is not a self-evident idea, nor a logically demonstrable truth. One can deny that God exists without contradicting oneself. Hume accordingly attacks all three of Descartes' proofs of God. Descartes' first two proofs of God's existence were causal proofs. They tried to prove that God exists as the only possible cause of my idea of him, and of my existence as a thinking substance. But we have no sensory impression of God as cause, nor do we have any impression of thinking substance as effect. Moreover, in both of these causal proofs of God's existence, Descartes relied upon the clear and distinct idea that a cause must have as much reality as its effect. This idea, which to Descartes was clear and distinct, and such that no rational mind could doubt it, to Hume is totally meaningless. It can provide neither a rational nor empirical basis for causality. As for Descartes' third proof of the existence of God, which he presented in the fifth meditation, it used the ontological proof which St. Anselm offered in the 11th century. It argued from our innate idea of God as having all perfections, and therefore necessarily having the perfection of existence, to the inference that God necessarily exists. Hume destroys this proof by first of all reminding us that the empiricist philosopher John Locke has already shown that there are no innate ideas, that we have only those ideas which come to us from our experience of impressions. St. Anselm's ontological proof of the existence of God claims that the idea of God is self-evident to reason. God has all perfections. He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and good, and therefore he could not be lacking in the perfection of existence. Hume replies to this with his empirical test of ideas. If there is no impression in experience, the idea is worthless, meaningless. But we can have no sensory impressions of a supernatural being, and thus the idea of God cannot pass the empirical test. Hume mercilessly attacks those who have tried to prove that God exists by using this ontological proof. How do you know God has these attributes? Where is a sense impression of each of these attributes? Here are his own biting words, quote, "Our ideas reach no farther than our experience. We have no experience of divine attributes." I need not conclude my syllogism. You can draw the inference yourself. End quote. And so the classical ontological argument which seeks to prove by reason that God exists from our innate and self-evident idea of him is destroyed. One classical proof of God which Descartes did not use is called the argument from design. This ancient attempt to prove by reason that God exists was used by St. Augustine in the 4th century and by St. Thomas in the 13th century, and it bases itself upon the wonderful order, harmony, and beauty that is found throughout nature. Order cannot come into being by chance, but only by the plan of a designer. From these premises it is argued that God exists as a necessary intelligence which planned and designed this entire enormous harmonious order of nature for the benefit of humanity. This was the proof of God that Hume considered the most important to demolish, since it was the most widely accepted proof of God's existence in the Age of Enlightenment. Never before in the history of the Western world had educated human beings had so clear a picture of the magnificent orderliness of the physical universe as was evidenced by the Newtonian world machine and by the rapid progress in scientific discoveries and technological inventions. The celestial clockwork of the planets, the clockwork of the circulation of the body, the blood in the human body, the clockwork motion of all bodies on earth, are the workings of the laws of nature, providing the harmonious order of the universe. Science was just beginning to see the dimensions of this vast harmony. What better evidence of the orderliness, regularity, benevolence to mankind, of the entire design of the universe could there be than the laws of science? And no other evidence, in the mind of the Age of the Enlightenment, was needed to prove that a master intelligence, a master designer of this universal machine necessarily exists, and that this benevolent, all-knowing, and all-powerful designer is God. This was the form that the Newtonian age gave to the argument from design, to the rational proof that God exists as the only possible source of the harmonious design and arrangement of all the parts of the universe. The argument from design became the central belief of a new Christian doctrine called Deism, a religious view which proudly based itself upon reason alone, rejecting revelation and all appeals to faith, to prophecies, and to miracles as irrational and absurd for the modern age of science. Deism demanded that the concept of God be made consistent with reason and with science. The necessary laws of nature and the necessary order which they bring about is enough proof. Indeed, it is the best proof that God exists, says the deist. Hume's lifelong delight was the demolishing of the argument from design, which was the heart of the religious doctrine of deism. In his book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, he used the form of a Platonic dialogue with which to mount his most powerful attack upon deism. Three characters play the roles of an extremely orthodox, pious believer in Christianity, a deist who argues for a natural, rational, scientifically relevant religion, and a skeptic who undermines both of them. The voice of Hume speaks through Philo, the skeptic, who pokes fun especially at the deist who claims to have a rational, natural religion. Our sense impressions, says Philo, the skeptic, are the basis of all our scientific knowledge, and they give us no evidence for the claim that the universe is perfectly orderly and harmonious, nor do they guarantee that such an order, as it does exhibit, will continue. Moreover, Hume's analysis of causality showed that the causal order within the universe is nothing but a constant conjunction of our impressions. The Enlightenment notion that the scientific laws of nature are absolute, fixed, necessary, and eternally true must be abandoned on Hume's theory of causality. It follows that the idea of the harmony and complete orderliness of nature is derived from no sense impression and is a meaningless idea. As for the claim that a conscious mind, a supreme designer, namely God, designed the world and planned it purposefully for the benefit of mankind, upon what constant conjunction of impressions is this based? Since we have no impressions of God as the designer of the world, we cannot even claim that there was a single designer at the beginning of the world. A great number of people join in building a ship or in framing a constitution for a state. Why not suppose that several gods put together the world? On the other hand, why is it necessary to suppose that the world is a machine put together or planned by conscious intelligence? Why not by natural processes of motion and growth? The world, said Philo, plainly resembles more an animal or a vegetable than it does a watch or a knitting loom. Moreover, says Hume, look hard at the world and see whether it is the work of an all-powerful and all-competent architect. If an architect showed you, quote, a house or palace where there was not one apartment convenient or agreeable, where the windows, doors, fires, passages, and stairs, and the whole economy of the building were the source of noise, confusion, fatigue, darkness, and extremes of heat and cold, you would certainly blame the contrivance. You would assert that if an architect had such skill and good intentions, he might have remedied all or most of these inconveniences, end quote. And in the human world, adds Hume, do you find evidence that it was well designed by a benevolent and loving designer? How then can you explain the misery, pain, and evil in human life? Quote, look around this universe. Inspect a little more narrowly these living creatures, how hostile and destructive to each other, how contemptible or odious to the spectator. A blind nature pouring forth from her lap without discernment or parental care, her maimed and abortive children. These arguments in the dialogues concerning natural religion were Hume's most powerful attack upon the religion of Deism of the Age of Enlightenment. He raised, finally, as was typical of him, the question, why then do people accept this mistaken belief in the existence of God on the basis of the argument from design? For two reasons, says Hume. They learn these beliefs in early childhood, and by the process of socialization, they continue to hold them. But how can it be explained that these beliefs are passed on to children? What is the origin of religious belief? Hume's reply is that the origin of belief in God is fear. Fear of death, accompanied by the desire for immortality. Fear of the many forms of human misfortune. The roots of religion are in human feelings. Hume is also famous for his essay Of Miracles, which he wrote in 1748, in which his target is not the rational scientific religion of Deism, which denied the truth of miracles and prophecies, but the traditional Christian religion, which accepts their truths. Do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in the Old Testament miracle that the Red Sea parted to let the Israelites escape from bondage? Do you believe in the New Testament miracle that Jesus died and was resurrected? Hume has a few words to say to you. What, he asks, is a miracle? A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature by a divine, supernatural being. But the laws of nature, says Hume, state the constant conjunction of impressions in human experience. The weight of human experience outweighs any one single experience which claims that a miracle or violation of the laws of nature has occurred. Outweighs it so far, in fact, that it, quote, amounts to an entire annihilation, end quote, of the belief in the miracle. To claim that a miracle has occurred is to stand in opposition to all human experience, to all scientific knowledge, to all of the orderly and constant conjunction of human impressions. No single experience can carry more weight than the constant conjunction of human experiences. And, according to the constant conjunction of human impressions, men who have died remain dead. It is a miracle, says Hume, quote, that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country." End quote. When a miracle is alleged to have occurred, says Hume, error in some form will have infiltrated the claim. The wise man will decide that the testimony of the witness should be evaluated. The witness may be sincere, but under a delusion, or the witness may be deliberately lying. But, Hume concludes, no human testimony can have enough force against the bulk of human experience of the laws of nature to prove that a violation of these laws has occurred, that is, to prove a miracle. And finally, says Hume, no miracle can be an adequate foundation for religion. Insofar, then, as Christianity rests upon belief in the miraculous resurrection of Christ, it offends human intelligence. One American philosopher, J. H. Randall, Jr., comments on Hume's essay of miracles that Hume so demolished the religious accounts of miracles that ever since Hume, the defenders of Christianity have been busy trying to explain not that miracles are true, but how this illusory notion that there are miracles could have ever crept into Christianity at all. Last, we turn to Hume's ethics, or moral philosophy, the branch of philosophy which is concerned with the meaning of good and evil, of right and wrong action. Hume's ethics is a deliberate attack upon all rationalist ethics, such as Socrates and Plato represented. Both Socrates and Plato hold to the fundamentally rationalistic view in ethics that reason has primacy in moral conduct, that reason is the most important determinant in moral life. This rationalistic ethics is the position which Hume rejects and sets out to attack. In deliberate opposition to Plato's metaphor of reason as the charioteer who is master of the horse, Hume turns the metaphor around and says in one of his most famous statements, quote, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." End quote. What could he mean by this? That it is an attack upon Plato is clear, but how can Hume defend this turnaround, in which the horses, the lion, and the dragon are the masters of the man, of reason? How can he argue that reason ought to serve and obey the passions? Hume's point is that we have two kinds of knowledge of relations of ideas, as in the formal abstract statements of mathematics and logic, and knowledge of matters of fact, which is derived from sense impressions. But, Hume argues, these two kinds of knowledge of formal abstractions and descriptions of factual constant conjunctions, cannot motivate my moral conduct as Plato thought, nor can they fight against the passions. What does move us to act is our desires, feelings, sentiments, the prospect of what will give us pleasure or pain. Knowledge of mathematics and causal relations are useless to motivate us to act. They are useful only to help us get what we are motivated toward by desire. A used car dealer's knowledge of mathematics and of the trade-in value of cars will not motivate him to virtue. It will only be of service to him in his sentiments of honesty or dishonesty, whichever dominates. This is what Hume means by saying reason is the slave of the passions and should serve and obey them. Reason provides the means, the instruments or devices, for gaining what the passions desire. Moreover, Hume insists that reason cannot criticize my motives. It cannot find fault with the passions and feelings which move me to act, no matter what they are. Hume makes this point in a striking and terrifying way. Quote, "It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." End quote. Reason does not require me to choose one or the other. Reason can bring to bear only formal relations or ideas or constant conjunction of fact, and both are irrelevant to what motivates my choice, my passions. But if reason cannot govern our moral action, contrary to Socrates and Plato and rationalistic ethics, and if reason cannot criticize the motives for action which arise from desire, then how is ethics possible? How is it possible to determine the meaning of good and evil, of right and wrong? How is it possible to make moral judgments about my own or another person's acts or character? Since moral judgments are not based on mathematics or matter of fact, on what are they based? Hume's answer is that they are based upon certain sentiments or feelings which can be discovered to be in constant conjunction with certain actions. Let us not ask what people ought to regard as good, he says, but instead what in empirical fact they do approve. let us see whether there is any constant conjunction between moral approval and the kinds of actions which are approved. And he concludes that morality is based upon a universal sentiment of benevolence or fellow feeling. We approve of traits such as being just, truthful, humane, altruistic, cooperative. All these traits please our sentiment of benevolence and are useful to us or to others. By contrast, we feel disapproval universally of traits contrary to the sentiment of benevolence: unjust, lying, deceitful, murderous, or viciously antisocial traits. Hume gives as an example a man being congratulated on the fine character of his future son-in-law, as a man of honor, of humanity, fair and kind in his treatment of others, quick to learn, sound in his knowledge, witty, cheerful, courageous. All these traits approved of in the prospective son-in-law are considered virtuous, Hume points out, because they exhibit the sentiment of benevolence and are useful to society at large and to the persons making the moral judgments. Thus, moral judgments, according to Hume, are based on nothing but our feelings and sentiments of what is agreeable and useful to us and to others. But you may well ask, Hume's empiricist ethics tells us what people actually do approve of as good. But how does this tell us what we wish to know? What is really good? Only a normative ethic such as Plato's, which defends standards or ideals for conduct, can tell us what is worthy of being approved of. Hume has once more been the destroyer. In ethics, he has taken aim at the rationalists who claim to give us rational moral rules to live by, a normative ethics. Hume has left us with an ethics which is nothing but the expression of our feelings of benevolence, fellow feeling, pleasure, and utility. How does Hume manage to live with so much destruction, the wreckage of so many enduring traditional beliefs? How much skepticism with regard to our knowledge can we live with? Hume prods us on into skeptical doubt as to the reliability of our scientific knowledge and to the destruction of normative ethics and religion as meaningless and misleading nonsense. He urges, quote, "When we run over to libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? Take in hand any volume of divinity or school of metaphysics, and let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." End quote. What then have we left? What have Hume's empiricist principles left for us? In the world of fact, we are limited to our impressions and our ideas. We do not know what causes them to appear and reappear. We have no knowledge that an external world exists. We have no knowledge that we have personal identity as a continuous self through our lifetime. We have no knowledge of ultimate reality or of God. The idea of both physical and mental substance is meaningless. The scientific laws of nature are nothing but constant conjunctions of our own impressions and psychological compulsion. Religious beliefs are worthless pretensions to knowledge. The traditional rules of reason for moral guidance are without any motivating power. There is no logical, rational, or objective foundation of any kind for our knowledge. Science, religion, and ethics are reduced to human psychology, to the laws of association of ideas, or to sentiments and fears. What then is left? Hume's answer is to offer a mitigated, modified skepticism. When reason fails, nature takes over. The guiding principle in human life is other than reason. Like animals, humans are creatures of instinct. Our animal instinct predisposes us to have trust in the senses and to rely on such limited knowledge as we have. Total skepticism is impossible. Quote, "No one can persevere in it even for a few hours." End quote. Philosophical reasoning, such as his own, cannot, says Hume, destroy our instinctual beliefs in an external world, that fire burns, that the sun will rise tomorrow. Through animal instinct, we have animal faith in the world of the senses, and thus we are able to function in the world. Animal faith, not philosophy, governs our lives. By introducing the psychological factor of animal faith, Hume has mitigated, modified, lessened his extreme skepticism with regard to all our knowledge. But he has done this not by showing us some objective foundation for our knowledge, but by showing us once again that our common sense knowledge, like science, religion, and ethics, is based only upon human psychology. Through animal faith, our ordinary life continues. We do not walk out the top window of the Washington Monument. But in the intellectual world, animal faith does not lessen the destructiveness of Hume's philosophy to our claims of knowledge. But is Hume consistent in denying the existence of the self and the validity of scientific laws? Are atomic sensations adequate to account for human experience? Is the mind merely passive in perception? These criticisms we will see raised against Hume. But refuting Hume will be a task for all theory of knowledge that follows him. Subsequent philosophers, and especially Immanuel Kant, will attempt to answer Hume's skepticism and to find a foundation for knowledge. Hume remains a strong influence, as we will see, upon contemporary British analytic philosophy.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.